Good morning.
Good morning.
What's the difference between knowing and understanding?
I know the facts that math could be helpful, but I do not understand math.
Okay. So there's some kind of, I'm going to use the word to define it, right? Knowing, there's knowledge,
Yeah,
but it sounds like you're saying, but I don't know how to apply it.
yes.
I don't know how to make use
Yes.
of it. Anything to add to that?
In many ways, knowing is to be aware. I am aware of a lot of things, but I do not, as she says, know the facts or know how to apply it, or, any of those things.
Yeah. That's kind of the essence of it, isn't it? There's an awareness, there's some vague knowledge about this thing. It exists.
And it's important, it's crucial. Math is very, very important, and if you can know how important it is and not be able to grasp it, not be able to have somebody sit down and explain it to you, that's very hard.
Yeah. So, yeah, so you're kind of taking it another step further, which is there's a consequence
Yeah,
when I only know, but I don't really understand.
I can't apply it.
I think there's also an experiential element that goes with understanding.
Okay?
And our understanding hopefully deepens through time and
Yeah.
experience.
It's interesting that you bring that up because I had a couple examples that I thought of that are very much along the experiential line. I might know that minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit is cold, right? It's got a minus in front of it. It's cold. But if I haven't actually experienced that, I don't really understand what minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit is. Elaine and I have some friends who live in Alaska, and this happens at temperatures lower than 20 degrees, but he said, I can take out a steaming cup of coffee, throw it up in the air, and it will be ice crystals before it hits the ground.
Not yours.
When it's like minus 40 degrees in Alaska. Similarly, I might know that a Carolina Reaper pepper is hot. I've heard this. But until I actually try it, I don't really understand how hot it is. The last time we discovered that Peter knows who Jesus is. That's kind of where we ended up in the middle of chapter 8. Jesus asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? They told him John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And he asked them, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answered him, you're the Christ. So Peter got the answer right. Isn't that who Jesus is? He is the Christ. But to Peter and the other disciples, Peter gets a bad rap because he happens to be the one who speaks first most of the time, it seems like. But every once in a while we hear, and all the other disciples said the same.
Yeah.
We're going to run into that later today. But do they really understand who Jesus is? We're going to find out the answer to that question in the text that we examine today. My guess is you already know the answer to the question. Let's take a look back really quickly before we get started today, though. Last time, we took a little walk through the first half of Mark's gospel account, and we identified ways in which there are repetitive stories. Jesus attracts followers. He attracts disciples. He calls them, in fact. The crowds come to him. No matter where he is, they find him. And he also attracts opponents, notably the religious leaders of the day. Jesus teaches. What else does Jesus do an awful lot of in these first few chapters? You remember?
He feeds.
Well, he feeds people, that's gonna be in the chapters we look at today for the most part.
I
But
said miracles.
miracles, yeah, I mean,
It's one of them.
the first thing that we hear, he casts out demons, he casts out a demon. He casts out a demon, and he heals people. In fact, everywhere he goes, that's one of the reasons why there's so many crowds. In some sense, it seems like they're there for the show. If you look back in chapter 1, toward the end of chapter 1, he talks about in verse 38, and he said to them, "Let us go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." And he wants to teach, but he's being overwhelmed by people coming to be healed, and probably by people who want to see him healing people. I mean, that's exciting. We haven't seen this sort of a thing before. Do people even say those sorts of things? Jesus also demonstrates power over nature. There's another miracle. If you remember him calming the storm in chapter 4. And as I said, even as early as chapter 2, people start questioning Jesus. Early in chapter 3, he heals the man in the synagogue on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees immediately go out and plot with the Herodians how to destroy Jesus. And these are two groups of people who normally don't have anything to do with each other, and yet they are threatened by Jesus and seem to be working together about how they can destroy him. And at the end of our time last week, we discussed the question that I posed the week before, which was, what is this first half of Mark? What is Mark's emphasis here? What does he seem to be trying to, or what question does he seem to be trying to answer?
Who is this guy?
Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? And we have that, made very plain to us right there in those last verses that I read from chapter 8, where Jesus is with his disciples and they're talking about his identity. And Peter gave the right answer, sort of. Our friend Kurt Nickham calls this Peter's mediocre confession. Because he got the words right, but he got the content wrong. He had the knowledge, but not the understanding. How can I say that? Well, what is Jesus' response? And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him.
That's what I don't understand. Why he wants to get his word out, preach to the people, but yet there are situations where where he heals someone and he'll say, but don't say anything.
Yeah.
Don't tell anyone. And I'm thinking, well, wait, I'm kind of confused. Why would you do that?
Let's go back and talk about that just for a second. And you were right. He has already fed the people. I got mixed up in my chapter order there. But he has done that. And one of the reasons why that popped back into my mind was chapter 6, which is before the feeding of the 5,000, where we have Jesus sending out the 12. And he empowers them, right, to heal and to teach. And they go out and do it. And the next thing you know, there's 5,000 men plus the rest of the crowd there with Jesus. Now, in this particular moment, that might not stand out, but after we've read the whole story, after we're familiar with all of it, and we know how wrong the disciples were when they answered the question, who is Jesus? Not wrong in terms of the words, but wrong in terms of the understanding of what those words meant. You have to ask yourself, what were they telling people? When they went out to teach and heal,
they were talking about miracles and signs and wonders, and not the teaching. I think Jesus wanted to focus on the teaching.
Yes.
Everybody else wanted to see the symbols.
and they were probably teaching Messiah. Now, what does Messiah mean to the Jews of this day?
A victory over, they would reign.
Yeah.
Maybe their time.
We're
Some
gonna-
of them are that way, yeah.
for most people in this day and age, when you said Messiah, they were thinking about an earthly king like David who was going to drive the Romans out and reestablish the kingdom like it was back in the glory days.
That's right.
And you can see this in some of the intertestamental literature that's not part of our Bible, but it still gives us insight into what the people were thinking. And in fact, that's one of the places where Son of David becomes an established term for the Messiah, and we're going to hear somebody say that later in what we look at today. But one of the reasons I think Jesus kept saying, don't tell, is you're using the right words, but nobody understands what that means. I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready for people to actually know who I am. And the more you tell them, the Messiah is here, or even if it's just, there's this great miracle worker here, it's getting in the way of his teaching to let them know who he really is, what it means to be the Christ, the Messiah.
I think Peter might have misunderstood from the beginning, because you read John, it's John and Andrew, who are the first followers. Andrew comes and tells Peter, seen the Messiah. And so instantly in his mind, he creates this image, this before he ever met Jesus. So in his mind, maybe he's got it wrong from the very beginning. He never did understand. Like you said, you know the words, but don't know what it means.
But they struggled so much with the concept. He keeps saying he's going to die and come back to life. Even we struggle with that.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a lot of confusion.
So in this second half of the book, Mark deals with the question that I posed at the end of the previous lesson, and I've already mentioned it. What does it mean to be the Christ? And the fact that Mark allocates so much space to telling stories that address this question, that provides a clue about why Jesus would tell the disciples not to reveal his identity. How? The question suggests that even if the disciples, and Peter specifically, use the correct word to identify Jesus, they just don't understand who he is. So by the time we finish today, I hope that we'll accomplish several things. I hope first that we'll just have a better lay of the land, right? The whole picture of how Mark put his account together, how the rest of the story flows in a big picture sort of a sense. Second, I hope that we'll have a better idea of how Mark answers this question. What does it mean to be the Christ? And finally, I hope we'll also begin to identify some of the other key ideas that Mark wants his readers and us to understand, not just to know, but to understand. So, looking ahead to the rest of Mark, some types of events that Mark records in chapters 1 through 8 continue to happen in 9 through 16, but the emphasis shifts. There are fewer healing and exorcism stories, fewer miracles generally speaking, but there's more actual teaching, not just statements that Jesus did teach, but teaching, where Jesus is teaching people actively. Most notably, though, there's more opposition, and you'd expect that, right? I mean, we know the end of this story, so we know how it's going to end up for Jesus, and so we know there's going to be more opposition. One of the interesting characteristics of structure in the rest of this part of the book is that if you back up just a little bit from where we ended up last time, Jesus heals a blind man. And that's the first occurrence where we're specifically told that he healed, that he restored sight to somebody. Interestingly, that comes right after a section in which he asked the disciples, "Are you blind?" And we'll talk more about that in later weeks. But he heals a blind man. And at the end of chapter 10, just before they go into Jerusalem, he heals another blind man, Bartimaeus. These are the only two examples of healings in Mark where we're specifically told that Jesus healed a blind man. And it's interesting because they are bookends around a section in which the disciples repeatedly reveal themselves to be blind. Now, that first story of him healing the blind man is kind of weird because Jesus seems to fail. We'll talk about that later. I don't want to get into it too much today. It is one of my favorite parts of Mark, though. So, plug for a later lesson. So these are bookends to what remains of Jesus' ministry outside of Jerusalem. I just want to point that out to show how Mark arranges the material. And I believe we're supposed to read what happens in between with an understanding of he's talking about blindness. And if you notice, at the end of the first healing story, when the man opened his eyes, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And when we get to the story of Bartimaeus, when they bring him to Jesus, and Jesus says, "What do you want me to do for you?" Which is kind of interesting because just in the previous story with James and John, they came to him and said, "We want you to do whatever we ask of you."
Yeah.
So they came to ask the question, and Jesus said, "Well, what do you want me to do?" And in this case, he asked the man, "What do you want?" And the man says, "I want to see." And Jesus said to him, "Go your way. Your faith has made you well." And immediately he recovered his sight and went back home to his family, rejoicing. No, wait a minute. That's not what it says. And followed him on the way. That's interesting too. Where's Jesus going? Next verse. Now when they drew near to Jerusalem. And so I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but it's pretty cool when you think about the whole story here. Bartimaeus is the disciple that the disciples ought to be. He sees now clearly, and his response is to follow Jesus. Okay. Now, somebody mentioned just a few minutes ago that there are 3 occasions in this last, in between here, in between these stories of the blind man, where Jesus says, "We're going to Jerusalem. They're going to treat me bad. They're going to kill me. And I'll rise in 3 days." Let's take a look at those just so we can kind of get them into our minds. One of the cool things about this, and this is just, I think this probably just happened randomly, but every one of those instances happens around verse 30 or so of chapters 8, 9, and 10. So they're really easy to remember and find again. 8:31, 9:31, 10:32, I think it is. So let's take a look at this, because it's a major feature of this section of Mark's Gospel. In chapter 8, verse 31 and 32, "And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly." Okay. So as opposed to speaking in parables, as he did to those outside that we saw in chapter 4, he's explaining this to his disciples plainly. Chapter 9, verse 31. "For he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise." Chapter 10, verse 32. Toward the end of the verse, "He began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise." We're not going to have time to really get into the details of the answer to this question, but there's another full lesson that's only on this topic. It's coming in the series later. But think about this as you continue to read in Mark. How did the disciples respond to Jesus's predictions? Because it's instructive and it tells us something about their mindset and where they are in their understanding of who Jesus is.
They didn't understand it.
They didn't. They
And
didn't.
they thought they could stop it.
And they thought what?
They could stop it.
Yeah, so Peter, his
He rebuked
initial
Jesus.
response to the very first one is, no,
We're not gonna let that
Jesus,
happen.
you got the story wrong. That's not what I learned in Sabbath school about the Messiah. You don't die. You go and you become king.
But they were also afraid. You know, after the second time, on 9:32, but they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him.
Yeah. So this is picking up on another major theme that we'll see as we go through this series, which is the concept of fear. And on several occasions, Jesus specifically contrasts fear with faith. We already saw that last week in chapter 4, when they're in the boat. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" The clear implication is if you had faith, you wouldn't be fearful. Now, I'll defend them a little bit about being afraid to ask him. What happened the last time somebody said something to Jesus after?
Get behind me, Satan.
Yeah, they got called Satan. So
Yeah.
that might have been a little bit of an inhibitor. Right? And just before that, in that section at the end of chapter 8, where they're arguing about the bread, Jesus peppers them with questions, 7 of them in a row. Boom, 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 ending with, "Do you not yet understand?" And you can almost hear Jesus's frustration with this situation. It's weird to talk about Jesus being frustrated, but Mark tells us, here's another example. In chapter 6, verse 6, he's been back to his hometown of Nazareth, and nobody, so this is a carpenter. We know his family. Who does he think he is kind of the idea that you get from there. And in verse 6 it says, "And he marveled because of their unbelief." It sure sounds like Jesus was surprised. He had some sort of reaction that wasn't, "Well, I knew this was going to happen." I mean, we know that he does, and yet at the same time, Mark still expresses. I mean, we know he even knows what people are thinking. We saw that in chapter 2 with the story of the man that they let down through the roof. And he says, "Go your way, your sins are forgiven." And the Pharisees in the room were thinking. They didn't even say it out loud. They were thinking, who can forgive sins but God alone? So he knows, and yet he is still, it seems almost like surprised, at least marveled. It's just amazing. How can this actually be? And so it's kind of an interesting insight, I think, into the humanity of Jesus in these situations. Did you notice anything repeated? I mean, other than the facts of what's going to happen in those 3, some people call them passion predictions, the passion as the events surrounding the death of the Christ. In those 3 passion predictions, did you notice the name or the title that Jesus gives himself? Son of Man, yeah. That's one of 2 titles for Jesus that appear, I think, prominently in this section. Of course, this title has some Old Testament roots in Daniel 7, and it's used throughout Ezekiel. And at least in Ezekiel, it sure seems like that's just a kind of a poetic way of saying human being. Jesus has used this title 2 or 3 times before in the gospel, but it's prominent in each one of these 3. There's no variation. He uses it over and over. The last time he uses this statement it's gonna get him killed. We'll talk about that when we get there. There's another title that appears in the last story of this section. We've already talked about Bartimaeus. But Bartimaeus uses a term for Jesus that only he uses in Mark. Bartimaeus calls him son of David. Calls him son of David. I mean, he says, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. And many rebuked him, telling him to be quiet. But he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And then he does, in direct address, refer to him as Rabbi. But only Bartimaeus calls him son of David.
Bruce,
Hmm?
I have a note that and I didn't find it in the actual text, but my note says that the blind man also used rabboni, meaning my rabbi, a particularly intimate way of addressing Jesus.
Okay. I hadn't read that, but that's interesting. Kind of makes sense,
Well,
you know, with his response, you know, my rabbi, you know, and then he follows him on the way.
And
So the other
Jesus
time,
hadn't,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, well, and Jesus hadn't yet said to him, follow me.
Yeah,
He just did it.
well, which is kind of interesting. You know, normally, people approached rabbis and asked, may I follow you? When we talked about last week how Jesus flips that and he calls people to follow him. Here's a man who asked to be healed. He doesn't ask if I can be your follower, but he makes himself a follower. What were you gonna say, Ray?
Well, I was gonna say, help me understand, but a lot of what you've been talking about understand, so just help remind me. Maybe you can't help me understand, but, so when Jesus healed the guy with all the demons and the pigs ran off the cliff, we got deviled ham instead of deviled eggs that day, but, so didn't he want to follow Jesus? Didn't he ask
did.
Jesus if he could go with him? Jesus said, no, just go tell what the Lord's done for you.
Yeah.
Maybe he might have said, go show yourself to the priest too, I'm not sure.
No, in this case, you're right. They're in Gentile country.
Right,
We know this because of the pigs.
yeah.
You know, Jews wouldn't be raising pigs. And they're across the Jordan. And the guy does say, in chapter 5, verse 18, the man who had been possessed with many demons begged him that he might be with him. We talked about this a little bit last week, that when Jesus called the 12 specifically, in chapter 3, verse 14, and he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him. This man wants to be a disciple. I think that's what Mark is trying to let us know. And Jesus says, go and tell. Now, interestingly, this is the only place in Mark that Jesus says, go and tell. Why can he do that? And why would he? They're in Gentile country.
No Messiah expectation.
There's no messianic expectation. So feel free to go and tell. And in fact, when he tells him to go and tell, he doesn't say, go and tell them what the Christ has done for you. He says, go and tell what the Lord has done for you. A more generic term of leadership and power and authority that doesn't have all the connotations of Messiah. And so he says, go tell.
Well, you did help me understand then.
Cool.
So is it, this almost sounds sacrilegious, but since we're talking about understanding and knowing, so God had never, even though he made man, he'd never really been a man before that we have record of. But yet Jesus was both. So he had a different understanding. He had a different understanding and experience of what it was to be a man. So what's helped me is I see these snapshots of Jesus being God, of him literally being Yahweh, and then I see snapshots of him being a small boy, or being afraid, or being frustrated, being a man in there. So I think we have a good understanding that Jesus was kind of working through this deal too. Even though he was God, even though he knew, he may not have fully understood.
Yeah, and we see it in the garden. He knows what's gonna happen to him,
Yeah,
but he sure doesn't want it to.
Right.
no,
I mean, he's willing to, and that's the difference. That's what makes him worthy of our devotion, that he would, in essence, be the perfect disciple. He followed God's plan.
so I see commercials, Jesus gets us. So literally, he really does get us. He does understand us in a different way.
We're gonna move on and hope that we can get to the end of it today. In the next section, we see Jesus in the temple a lot. He enters the city to great fanfare, which we're familiar with, I'm sure, but that fades away. He spends some time in the temple, first cleansing it, and then interacting with the religious leaders, and he also taught there. We'll see some more of that in chapter 12. But the main feature in this section is more opposition from the religious leaders. Everybody takes their best shot at Jesus. The chief priests, the scribes, the elders in chapter 11, verse 27, the Pharisees with the Herodians again in chapter 12, verse 13, the Sadducees in 12, verse 18. And Jesus turns the table on their transparent attempts to trick him. Right, this is a fun section, I think, to read, because at every turn, they're trying to trick Jesus, and he's got an answer for everybody. And he even takes a few shots of his own at them. One of them is at the Sadducees. I think he's kind of having fun with them in chapter 12, where they come to him with a question about the man, the 7 brothers and the wife, and they keep going through the levirate marriage as each man dies and the brother takes the woman to be his wife according to the law. And then they ask him in the resurrection, which we don't believe in, whose wife
Right.
will she be? And Jesus says, you don't know the scriptures. Okay, well, another interesting thing about the Sadducees is that they only accepted the Pentateuch. They didn't accept the other writings of the Old Testament. And so when he said they don't know the scriptures, they literally don't know the scriptures. And then he says, you're very wrong. We'll be like the angels in heaven. They also don't believe in angels. Okay? And so I see this as really a humorous incident between them where I believe, what Jesus says is true. I'm not saying that he just said things to be saying things, but he knew how to say it in a way that poke. You guys, come on. You can do better than that. Right? But the big one is in chapter 12, verse 1, where Jesus spoke a parable. And if we remember that the reason that Jesus began to speak in parables to those outside, it was so that they would not understand. Chapter 4 talks about that, verse 11 and 12. And yet here's a parable in chapter 12 that they understand very, very well. So in chapter 12, verse 1, he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a pit for the wine presses and built a tower and leased it to tenants and went away into another country. Okay. Now, the Pharisees know their scripture. They might not understand it, but they know it, because when they hear that from Jesus, they hear Isaiah 5, okay, where Isaiah 5 verses 1 and 2 say, let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it, and he looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. you hear the parallels? That section in Isaiah was spoken against the leaders of Israel, the religious leaders of Israel. And he tells this story, and we know how it continues, with their insane thought that if we kill the heir, we'll somehow magically become the heirs and get it ourselves. And he says, finally, in verse 6, the owner had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to him, saying, they will respect my son. But those tenants said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. And they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. What will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read this scripture? Jesus tweaking again. Haven't you read the scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. And they were seeking to arrest him, but feared the people, for they perceived that he had told the parable against them. So they left him and went away. The irony is, and this section is full of irony, we'll get to that another time. The irony is that they're going to do it. Right? So Jesus tells them the parable. They know that he's told it against them, and then they're going to fulfill their part. And on top of that, that's God's plan. I find that fascinating. And it's very telling about their mindset. They're so threatened by Jesus that they can't see what their own scriptures say about them. And then they fulfill that. And in so doing, they fulfill God's plan. Another interesting feature of this last section of Mark after Jesus comes to Jerusalem is chapter 13. It's weird. It's some people call it the little apocalypse. There's language about the end times and so forth, and there's some confusion about, is Jesus talking about only the end times? Because there are other parts where he seems to be talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. There are a lot of different ways that this chapter has been interpreted, and we're going to discuss some of those when we narrow down our focus over the next few weeks. I think, just going ahead a little bit, there are components of both. He switches back and forth between talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the end times. And there are some good reasons to think that we'll get into in more detail later. The thing that I want you to notice, though, about it, as you know, from this big picture point of view, is that toward the end especially, Jesus says something several times to them. Stay awake. Chapter 14. The disciples can't stay awake. Right? I mean, almost immediately after, we have the stories of Jesus being anointed at Bethany and the Passover and the Lord's Supper, right? But then Jesus goes to pray in Gethsemane on 3 different occasions. He comes back and finds the disciples asleep. So I think that
goes back to your point earlier. They didn't understand.
Yeah.
At all.
They're very confused. They certainly are.
And there's no telling how many times they've been to that garden with Jesus and fell asleep. We don't know.
Yeah. In this case, though, he specifically tells them, sit here while I pray. He wants them to stay awake. Keep watch. But they go to sleep.
But there are people who are initially not his followers, who are understanding very well.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? And most of them don't have names.
Exactly.
And that's actually another part that I wanted to talk about a little bit this morning in the last few minutes that we have. There's definitely, we'll get there in just a second. There's a lot of irony in this section beyond what I've already talked about. When Jesus appears before Pilate, Pilate refers to Jesus as the King of the Jews. And later the soldiers will mock him and they'll use his title to make fun of him. And I think Pilate was kind of jesting at him too. And yet what's true? He's the king.
And
He's just not the king that they were expecting.
there are several, nods at a coronation.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, they absolutely enact
Oh, yeah.
a coronation scene with the crown and the robe and everything else. There's a second one, which is really kind of sad. When Peter is questioned by the people, Jesus has been arrested. What his common phrase when they say, "Surely you were with this man," he says, "I don't even know him."
And that's true.
And it's true. I mean, it's both a lie. He clearly has been with him. And yet it's true. I don't know who this man is. Or in the terminology that we're using today, I don't understand who this man is. Why would he do this? There's an interesting feature that you alluded to about there being prominent roles for minor characters in this last section. There's a woman who anointed Jesus at Bethany, about whom Jesus says, "And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." We don't even have her name. There's the servant girl who accuses Peter and moves that part of the plot along, unnamed, just some person. The women who follow Jesus to the cross, now they are named, but we don't know much else about them besides the fact that they followed him to the cross and to the empty tomb. We have some others whose names we do know. Simon of Cyrene carries Jesus' cross. Joseph of Arimathea buries him. But they have their moment in the sun and then they disappear. And so there are prominent roles for these minor characters. And then we come to the resurrection at the end, in chapter 16. The women who witnessed Jesus' crucifixion go to his tomb to anoint his body, but instead they encounter a young man in a white robe who tells them that Jesus, who was crucified, is risen. And he instructs them to go and tell. Here's the only other instance in Mark of somebody saying, "Go and tell." But here's what Mark tells us. "And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." Now, almost everybody's Bible at least has some representation of verses 9 through 20. In most translations that I'm aware of, it's set off with brackets or something like that, and there's an explanation. But it sure seems like this is the intentional end of Mark's account. And if that's true, it's kind of weird. I mean, even if we didn't have the other gospel accounts, this is kind of weird, at least in the sense that it's abrupt.
It's not very helpful.
And on the surface, it's not very hopeful. That is exactly true. But if the story seems unfinished, and we wonder what is next, perhaps that's because that's what Mark wanted. He wanted us to contemplate how the story continues and what might be our role in that story. Here's why I think it's secretly or subtly hopeful. We know that at some point, faith won out over fear. Otherwise, why would Mark have written the story? these ladies told other people, and they told other people, and they told other people, and they told other people, and it's been true for 2,000 years. To the point where we're sitting here today reading the story of Jesus that Mark felt compelled to write to some group of people about 2,000 years ago. If that's the case, then the end of Mark's account poses a question for us. How will we respond to the gospel and to Jesus' call to discipleship? Will we respond in fear? Or will we respond with faith? And to the extent that Mark's abrupt ending of the gospel focuses on that question, it makes perfect sense. We talked about this a little bit in the very opening class in the auditorium. We don't really know for sure who the intended audience of Mark was. It's not like the letters that we have from Paul that say, Paul an apostle to the church at Ephesus, or whatever the case may be. We do have tradition that says that Mark wrote down Peter's memoirs, essentially. That's from a historian named Papias. And so then we kind of start piecing together, okay, what's going on? And we suspect that it probably was written to Christians in Rome, mostly Gentiles, because Peter explains some Aramaic and Hebrew type phrases throughout. But we also have the background of the persecution there that would be causing them to fear. And Mark's, if that's the case, then what we think about how Mark ends suggests that he's trying to tell them, you're not the first people to be afraid about telling the story of Jesus. In fact, the only reason I can write to you is that some people who were initially fearful ultimately had enough faith to override that fear and tell. Well, we've now walked rapidly through the whole of Mark's account. Twice, if you count the first Sunday, very, very high level overview. These last 2 weeks, again, kind of a high level overview of things. But over the next 7 weeks, we're going to take a more leisurely walk through Mark, I guess you might say. And we'll take a couple of chapters at a time. It's still not going to be super in-depth. The whole point of what I'm hoping that we can accomplish in this series is to kind of take a step back and see the bigger picture. You know, it's fun to dig down into a particular story and pull out the detail, but it's dangerous too if we don't connect it to the rest of what's going on. And so this whole series is really designed from the point of view of let's take a wide angle lens and take a look at Mark. And then maybe let's zoom in a little bit. And that's what we'll do for the next 7 weeks, where we just take a couple of chapters at a time. And then for the last 4 weeks, we'll zoom back out more to our wide angle lens again and take a look at some themes that run through the whole story and so forth. It's a little different. I think it can be very good from the point of view of trying to get the big picture in mind when we're looking at the smaller bits. So, thank you for passing out the bookmark. That gives you your question for next time, which is, what do you notice about how people respond to Jesus? That's for Mark 1:1 through 3:6 for next time. See you then.
Thank you, Bruce.
That's there.
So, this would be, so they don't.
I can almost see him actually being excited about it in one sense, to say, we'll talk about it more.
I don't see it.
These are people who spent every we heard him teach. They were in on their private conversations that we don't even have record of. They saw him speak. You can imagine the countless of people he healed and the other miracles he performed. Peter seems to be, if this is coming from Peter, he's saying, we did all these things. We have that experience. Even we the exciting part is, can imagine him having this to say. Let me help you understand. From this perspective of somebody who thought they understood it, let me help you understand. And that might be the focus of Peter and his shortcomings. So it makes sense from a guy who's very professional and transparent about, yeah, I was an idiot. I didn't know.
Are you off this morning?
Well, not really long, so I have to keep going, keep going. We're gonna go, so I have to actually, still have elderly. I'm still working on that, and I found,
Sorry, I missed your birthday. No, I looked at it, oh, it came and went. I know, well, you didn't have to.
thank you, and, but they're flat. And it's not easy.
Good, and everybody's good.
It's still.
Kids.
If you want to add.
He's telling me you had that coffee and stuff.
And then I have two, they're Ronnie died 2 weeks ago. And so, and there's a lot of and because he's been young, and so because he's weak, I know, he's weak and he's ill. I got a text last night at 10 saying, well, I'm back home now, but Kelly probably would have. I'm back again sometime all her night, and I think that's just saying I'm back in my room.
Okay, well, my first one.
But,
He has a special.
I won't worry about it.
I was the focus of
It's just the cough that we have.
Do we want to go to church talk?
yeah.
We don't call somebody else.
Okay, y'all later. Bye.
Don't let Peter think he's not a part. Disciple.
Oh,
I know.
Now, that first part of that,
Cut the camera.
is amazing. I'm thinking about chapter 4. The healing of
Yeah.
I don't know if that was the right decision, but we felt
For the
that was
council.
the right
Oh, she's
decision.
looking at this class?
Yeah.
Yeah, y'all do what you gotta do, we're gonna do what we
Right,
gotta
and
do.
it's kind of
And then,
Sherry Byers? Oh, no, Sherry.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
and then
Yeah.
to go back to the
Sorry.
We read past that.
That's a short one.
Wow.
Yeah. And I'm not sure it's anything. I know, that's what I told Randy, I said, it's short and.
But there's a lot of questions.
Okay.
I'll try to say that.
One thing
Right.
that stood out to me was Eric Erickson's cycle.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. This is
Good stuff.
Because when you're telling me,
Even then.
He was mentioned in that chapter. Yeah. Oh, yeah. My least favorite was. But
Maybe she.
over the next chapter, but
That's a terrible thing to say, but no.
it's longer anyway.
Hopefully next time we're supposed to be filling ourselves.
yes, yeah.
and trim, yeah, and I thought they'd be here this morning, I didn't pay them, but, I think they're gonna do it.
And I think she best really and she was
Hey, well, go, when you see the picture, you'll see that that's on a little puppy dog in the corner, isn't it?
Okay. It's just so crazy, you know, big.
I'm gonna call it a dog, I don't care.
I think they're 84.
Where you going?
Charles is 2.
Have you heard, Phil,
Carolyn's 9 years. So Charles is 84. But you know, in that situation, is it genetics? Is it random, you know?
all you have to do is,
You don't know. It's just,
but it's always interesting.
but it's
So I thought I would just say
sad. But her kids, I mean, they really all do a good job.
and I signed up
And
for a course
you know, it's still very attached.
And
And
Susan learned it for years ago.
the boy that lived with them, and I went to the military. James, was it James? That doesn't sound right. Okay, he's the one. Don, don't tell the stories. He would go out to his car in the morning, and Don would sit there. And
Yeah,
they would sit there for a while. And then they'd talk. And Don finally said, so what's going on with you? What are you doing out there? And he said, well, I'm waiting for my gas to get full. Because was he from, he had an accent. Yeah, he had been a military brat, he'd been all over. And he went over to Noriega in Panama at Clay.
Yes, Carnahan.
Yes, yes, together we got it. He had 2 brains, yes, exactly. Exactly. Sometimes I need more than 2 brains.
Oh, I know I do.
Oh, but Donna Sherry were just, doing something that, that was on the news, and having all, they went down there, Army went down there. And Clay said, hey, guess where I'm calling you from? I'm using Noriega's phone. So they're like, oh, no, you can't use it. Yeah, he was, and that was just part of it, they had a baby, and he was there, Clay Carnahan. And is he still alive? Is he around? Is he? I'll have to ask. I'm gonna ask. And I don't know if he's often. This is my 6th one. third square, 2 shades. It has literally sucked my blood. His brother was in there. I had blood that was about that house. Horrible. And they do push your feet. Yes. Mom had one when she was in the nursing home. This one night I went to eat with her. She rose up from the bed. She was too sure. I thought she was gonna clean it. Oh, she tried to eat.
Y'all do whatever y'all want. Y'all wanna do that? Or y'all's are individual?
I can if I want to. Yeah. Yes. Rose was
Is that what y'all want?
And I'm glad
I
that
would figure you guys would like go for
I was told to
each lot.
No, not in road.
that you need to take so, but yes, I'm like, yeah, but that tar trucks. I said this weather has been. Zach, what time, Zach and I was very late, he was wrong, and those poor boys, and this is like within the last 10 years or something. Yes. And I was like, really? Oh, really? Does that not make sense?
Our grandson Elijah said he doesn't know.
Oh,
This is Elijah, this is Jane.
I'm Jan English. I
Nice to
used to
meet you.
babysit your dad.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
If that was possible. Oh, they were so cute. Those little boys would come with their little hooded jackets on. I think kids look so cute with their little faces sticking out that pointed head, you know, with the jacket. And they were
Your dad
good
used to be
boys.
cute, is what she said.
He still is.
What happened?
He still is. Don't you say that. I'll stand up for him.
Well, whenever I put Zach in Crater Roll, every Sherry and Andy were teaching him, and after this was on Wednesday night or something, Linda came up to me and she said, so how do you spell Zachary? I said, oh, I said, my head, come back and tell me. Oh, great. Because I had, you know, they ended up having to put me under, and I hadn't been there whenever he had done birth certificate or as far as, so it was just, I blacked out. I was just totally, not blacked out, blacked it out.
Blank there.
Yes, and she came down and told me, I said, you didn't tell him I asked, did you? No.
Yeah, he's always been a sweetheart.
Yeah.
And it's been fun watching you all grow up.
I try to keep it short.
Yeah.
Her husband and Papa played softball together, they were the Crushers. We had more fun than
We played basketball with Sunday.
yeah, we probably got a technical call in one of those games.
Yeah, I was playing with JV.
Yeah. Like the oldest man out there is a technical call for the top years.
The oldest man in the pushing for me, fell with it. Take that. Do what?
Sometimes the worst, that's what's so sad. The neurosis.
Good to see you too. I can't get to finally officially meet you. And how are you doing?
See ya.